I would like to welcome you to the second panel of the conference. Unfortunately, we don't have all the panelists, and Professor Schramm already read his paper, I understand, but we will have two panelists, Professor Anita Prażmowska and Dr. Thomas Lorman. Professor Prażmowska, I don't need to introduce neither Professor Prażmowska nor Dr. Lorman. Professor Prażmowska is a professor in international history, and she specializes in Eastern Europe and contemporary history. And Dr. Thomas Lorne here at UCM teaches modern East European history, and his new book on Hungarian constitution will be coming shortly. Yeah? So I would like to ask Professor Prażmowska, then we will have Dr. Lorne paper, and then I will say a few things about the exhibition that you can see in SSEES building when you are going for lunch. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. Now, I'd like to start with a contemporary view of, in other words, 1938, view of what was called the restoration of Cieszyn.
Momentem obchodu dorocznego święta niepodległości w stolicy, a jednocześnie obchodu 20-lecia jej odzyskania była rewia wojsk, którą ze specjalnie wzniesionej trybuny przyjął wódz naczelny marszałek Śmigel-Rydz w otoczeniu przedstawicieli rządu, generalicji i korpusu dyplomatycznego oraz liczniejszych niż zwykle tłumów publiczności zalegających trybuny i ulice Warszawy wzdłuż trasy przemarszu defilujących oddziałów. Wzbudził przemarsz grup regionalnych przybyłych z odzyskanego Zaolsia, gorąco oklaskiwanych przez publiczność. Złączonej z macierzą ziemi cieszyńskiej, dokąd przybył w towarzystwie pana premiera Składkowskiego, ministrów Kasprzyckiego, Poniatowskiego i Romana oraz licznej świty. Na cześć dostojnego gościa odbyła się na placu ćwiczeń w Cieszynie rewia wojsk, poprzedzona uroczystą mszą polową przed ołtarzem ustawionym na betonowym schronie wzniesionym tu przez Czechów.
remember this phrase, zwarci prężni, najlepsza kawaleria w świecie. Those of you who haven't polished up your Polish in preparation for this, just very briefly, let's finish it. What this was two clips. One from, the first one was from the celebrations of Polish Independence Days in Warsaw, where the delegation from the just recovered Cieszyn territories were marching by. And the second section was actually celebrations taking place in the recovered territories. Now, there we saw most, to me, quite a telling picture of Mass being celebrated on a bunker, which had been erected by the Czechs clearly before they were pushed out of that region. Now, what is striking about this newsreel, other than that they don't make them like that anymore, is the fact that this is a full pomp of the state. This is not just a settling of scores with the Czechs. The full might of the state, the military might is on display. It plays, there is a function, there is a purpose in that one, which goes well beyond the territory that Poland claimed for Czechoslovakia. So what I'm saying is that the issue of the Cieszyn, Silesia, or Transolza, whichever word we use, has two dimensions. One is the way in which the territory was divided between the newly emerging Czech state and the equally newly emerging Polish state in the period of 1918-1919, where they were both trying to define their borders. And critically, there wasn't yet a strong central authority and state. So what we have is actually, this is one of many attempts to define the borders. And then there is the second dimension, which this particular clip actually gave us, which is what happens in 38 and 39, where it's German policy that leads in the destruction of Czechoslovakia and where Poland joins, but for its own reasons. It is not actually Poland that decides what is going to happen there, but very much as a scavenger comes in, but with an agenda. It is not just the reclaiming of a small area. It is you could see, very powerful statement is conveyed to the people that the regime is militarized, ready, patriotic, and we will teach those Czechs a few lessons. And that is a regional issue. So what are the origins of this particular crisis? Now, in the broader significance of what is happening during the period 1918-1919 is the collapse of the big empires. So the collapse of Austrian Empire, Russian Empire, and also collapse of Germany insofar that its control beyond its border, creates a vacuum in which well-rehearsed national aspirations can be realized. We have self-appointed people and politicians from the pre-war period who have formulated previously and articulated demands for the creation of independent states, most notably Poland. And of course, during the wartime period, on the Polish side and the Czech side, we saw active politicians, so we know the Polish ones, but of course on the Moski and Piłsudski, but most obviously, but and Paderewski, but on the Czech side, Kramer, Masaryk, and Stefanik, men who are also planning and conceptualizing the idea of the independent Czech state, possibly Czechoslovak state, a joint state. So it's the collapse of these empires that creates a vacuum into which step in local initiatives. This is something that was already mentioned. It is not so much a policy defined in Warsaw. In these various areas, it is the local initiatives. And these local initiatives at that moment, 1919, actually determine physical control of regions. Now, on the 5th of November 1918, the Polish and Czech communities in Cieszyn agreed a demarcation line. And the demarcation line was vaguely defined. It was just a temporary solution. The assumption was that as soon as central authorities establish themselves, that proper negotiations will follow. Now, it would appear that those divisions, that agreement, that tentative agreement, was on the basis of ethnic distribution. In other words, majority Polish, majority Czech communities. But as we know, in Eastern Europe, there isn't such a thing as purely one ethnic territory, in particular the borderlands, and in this particular region, that ethnic principle, though appears to have been tentatively agreed, is not absolutely accepted, nor is it indicative of genuine control and historic presence. It is an agreed thing. Now, of course, in that area, what is rarely mentioned was also a German community, but that is a different story, much bigger one. Now, the other areas other than Cieszyn were Spiš and Oława, which I leave to my colleague, because I'm presuming that dealing with Slovakia, the last thing he would want is to sit there and listen to me take his topic away from him. Now, from the outset, it was known that this was going to be a very difficult decision, how to define these regions, who controls what. The Principality of Cieszyn had never been part of the Polish kingdom. Already in the 14th century, it became a through feudal arrangements, a feudal contact, part of the Czech kingdom, and then subsequently becomes part of the Austrian crown territories. In the 19th century, that region undergoes a dramatic change economically because of the development of coal mining. Now, the coal that is found in that region is very high quality coal. This is the coal that is converted into coking coal, which is critical in the production of steel, iron and steel. So the development of iron and steel production means that good quality coal is, of course, at a premium. And that is where we see the development of coal, in particular in the Karwina and Ostrava basins. Also steel production in that region, but also there are textile production. So generally speaking, it is not just a developed, industrially developed region, but it also is the most developed industrial, modern industrial part of the Austrian Empire. Let me try to get out of this one, which is where I show my limitations. Now, these are the territories that Poland gained from Czechoslovakia in 1938. In fact, this is the final picture. So one wonders, in the larger picture of things, you can see that Poland didn't really grab an awful lot, but it has, as I pointed out to you already, great significance. How did it come about then in, moving on now to the understanding of the crisis as it's now developing in the end of 1918, 1919, leading up to this particular problem? When the Austrian army effectively withdrew from the Czech territories, the Cieszyn Poles were the first ones of the two communities to actually establish a national council of the Principality of Cieszyn. The aim was to incorporate the region in Poland. Economic criteria were never far from the considerations of those both within that region, but also outside. In other words, that economic resource that was so important in that region. But in Prague also there were already ideas formulating along similar lines. Retaining Cieszyn, as it had been part previously of the territories, would mean that Czechoslovakia could have a bargaining counter. It would be a valuable ally to France. France, in spite of there being a multiplicity of debates in the Kedose and in the army on the question of the Eastern Front after the First World War, still there is a perception that an Eastern partner is necessary. And the future of Russia was not clear. So while on the one hand there was still an attempt to, plan perhaps Kerensky would be, perhaps the Civil War would generate some different. Bolsheviks in 1918, 1919, no one thought they were endured. They were rather a rather unusual scenario, but possibly nothing would come of it. So in France, there are debates on the possibility of there being some sort of, Eastern partner. Which country? Now, the newly emerging states offered new opportunities. And this is where the Czech politicians count on the fact that they have coal, which France needs. So France was felt particularly vulnerable about the areas on the German border, the Saarland coal, Alsace-Lorraine. So Czechoslovakia actually hopes to retain that region in order that it is a resource that the French will want, and they will politically engage both in cultivating alliances with Czechoslovakia, but also ultimately help Czechoslovakia economically. So Czechoslovakia and Poland both have their own reasons for retaining that particular area, and coal is the most important one. Now, the Polish-Czechoslovak conflicts, because there is still the issue. Let me move on. This is how it plays itself out, and you can see very nicely how control over that region changes, in particular in the Cieszyn region, because there you can see the initial line, which is the faint blue line, and then ultimately how that moves onwards from that point. So that area is still not consolidated, and it acquires an international dimension when the Czechs took military action to actually extend their control over the region in advance of a final international agreement. We know, of course, that with the opening of the Paris peace talks, what was debated there was not just the issue of long-term policy towards Germany, but also a number of contested areas in Europe as a whole. And Cieszyn is one of those small areas that is in fact debated extensively during the Paris peace talks. We very often demonize the Versailles Treaty and the Paris peace talks as a sort of, heavy-handed piece of legislation that was imposed upon Eastern Europe. And already I had heard earlier today a challenge to that idea, and I completely agree with it. Because what we have is actually a delegation being posted out there, a fact-finding mission to try to find out what happens. What the delegation realized was that the Poles and Czechs, not only did they have their own agendas, but they actually were using entirely different criteria for laying claims to the region. The Czech criteria was historic. And in that respect, they had a very strong argument. Cieszyn had not been part of the Polish kingdom. It had been part of the Czech territories and also Austrian crown territories. But what the Poles contended is that on ethnic grounds that is not a valid argument, because the ethnic composition of that region had changed in the 19th century with a heavy influx of Poles. So though that region is historically, the Poles have no claim, what they say is subsequently we acquired a claim because people living there, and not just the first generation but possibly fourth generation, are in fact Polish. Of course, we know that the criteria of identity is extremely difficult to handle. Is identity language? Is it self-definition, or is it religion? Very difficult one in the case of Cieszyn, because even there we have a Polish Lutheran community, so it would make the definition of Pole Catholic rather difficult, or maybe just religion, maybe just language, in which case second, third generation communities might well have lost their contact with Poland. So the arguments as they are presented by the Czechs and the Poles to the commission that was established in Paris, excuse me. These arguments don't ultimately lead to a simple conclusion, and the general feeling was that the drift of the debate was in the direction of what the French wanted to see, which is that Cieszyn, with its extensive coal mining areas, should go to Czechoslovakia. And of course, the first tentative agreements, which is in April 1919, that the idea is that the area that the Poles should have should be one that is mainly area that contains only 10 mines, some railway lines, whereas the Karwina coal mining basin should go to Czechoslovakia with 26 mines, and critically also the rail junction between Bochumin and Košice, which was very important to the Czechs. The uneasy agreements that are being negotiated in Paris are become problematic when Piłsudski makes it clear that he intends to hold general elections, and that these general elections will also include Cieszyn. So it was a form of a plebiscite, which in the long term they were planned for, but what the Czechs did is use that as an excuse to literally walk in and take territories. So what they do is extend their control, as we can see, right up to the blue dotted area, and ultimately the agreements, what was also pointed out was that this agreement was tentatively supported by the French, and the Poles were in a very weak position in terms of negotiating, to try to force the Czechs out. The final agreement takes place, or the final is in July 1920. International conference took place in Spa. The purpose of the conference was to discuss issues relating to Germany, but at this very same time, Poland faced extreme threat from the incoming Red Army. And what the Poles hoped was, at the Spa conference, that if they negotiated with the big powers, the matters that had not been resolved during the Paris peace talks were then handed down to further conferences. So what they hoped was that if they presented themselves as being conciliatory in relation to the Czech matter, then the big powers would supply them with equipment and military equipment to assist them in the conflict they were facing with the incoming Red Army. And therefore they accepted the demarcation line, which is the red line. And that effectively goes back to the point that the Poles get a smaller number of mines, and they never accept that this is the final arrangement. It suited, of course, the Czechs, because they have, most importantly, the biggest number of mines and the resources. So the matter is unresolved. It remains a sore point in Polish-Czech relations. One of the issues that has arisen in historic writing is, why were the Czechs so much more successful in putting their argument and physically, literally, capturing that region? The answer to that one is because Piłsudski wasn't really interested in that region. Piłsudski and the army were focused on the eastern border, on fighting and extending the border in east. And what was happening in Cieszyn, which very much is mirrored by what is happening in Silesia, were local initiatives. These patriots, local militias, Polish communities were not given equipment, were not supported in their claim that they wanted to be part of Poland, by the Polish state. Piłsudski's focus was entirely in the east. And that also meant, of course, that the diplomatic side didn't, as I pointed out, swing in Poland's favor. Now, the reason that I mentioned this particular last point is because what we saw in 1938, it acquires an entirely different dimension. It is literally like a new product, a new campaign. The conflict and its resolution had long-term implications on regional politics, but it was not the reason why Poland and Czechoslovakia didn't get on with each other. There were different, what we call światopogląd. The government in Czechoslovakia always looked towards linking itself with French policy in Eastern Europe. It had coal, it had resources, and it also had a reputation of a country that was stable, which Poland, by no stretch of imagination, could have been described at that time. It was also, interestingly, in the 1920s and until Hitler came to power, not a country to which the Germans were laying claim, whereas Poland was. Poland was seen as a potentially unstable country, not very reliable ally. Some French military men thought they would be good, others didn't. So there is no consistency. And also, there is the possibility of Germany reclaiming territories it had lost. So that could carry the possibility of war, since already we saw economic warfare between Poland and Germany. So in those circumstances, Poland and Czechoslovakia don't share the same perspective. Poland ultimately moves towards negotiating with Germany, in particular after 1934, whereas Czechoslovakia remained very firmly France's ally, not necessarily to its advantage, but there are nevertheless a number of initiatives, the little Locarno one, and then we also subsequently see the military and political arrangements which the French offer guarantees, but one could never describe it as comprehensive, but nevertheless political talks are taking place there. With the Poles, there isn't that ease, there is always that anxiety. So what we see is that the Poles came to view Czechoslovakia as a partner that was not worth getting involved. But the new opportunity arises when Hitler comes to power and very aggressively presents demands for the restoration of of German territories inhabited by German communities. Of course, the Germans in the Czech state were never part of the Third Reich. They were Germans from within Austria, but never mind, with good propaganda, that little detail can be slurred over, and good propaganda can make it sound, like a very watertight argument. So, of course, various sections of the German state and the Nazi party reached out to the Germans in Czechoslovakia, and the Poles knew about it. In fact, Poland was itself involved in trying to destabilize Czechoslovakia in the same way that Czechoslovakia was involved in various covert operations weakening Polish control. When Witos fled, he fled to Czechoslovakia. When the Polish Communist Party is disbanded, the new office is created in Prague. This is not an accident. This is all part of this, hostility that was there between the two states. So already from January 1938, Beck, Minister of Foreign Affairs, traveled over to Berlin, and he knew of the long-term plans that the Germans had for the destruction of Czechoslovakia. There was a lot to be gained for the Poles out of that one. One, because they believed good relations between Poland and Germany would lead to the resolution of the Danzig issue, which was a problematic thing. I won't go in there. It's a very interesting subject, but I'm sure that we can talk about it at some other occasion. What they hoped, though, that by grabbing some territories from Czechoslovakia, weakening Czechoslovakia, Poland could become the arbiter of Central European issues. In other words, Poland hoped to stand as a facilitator in negotiations between Hungary and Romania, between Czechoslovakia and Hungary. So it's all the post-Trianon issues. And Poles felt that if they were stronger, if they reclaimed territories, influence in Slovakia, they would be the ones that would be deciding how things happened. The tragedy for the Poles, for the Polish government of the time, was that once Britain and France agreed to the principle of cession of territories to neighboring states, they didn't need Poland. So the Munich conference, 29th of September, is the breakdown in Polish hopes, it collapse of Polish hopes, because they hoped that they and Germany would bring Czechoslovakia down, carve it up, create a little Czech state, facilitate Slovak independence, and then distribute territory around there. In fact, Czechoslovakia was literally handed over to Germany. And that meant that the Poles have to suddenly snatch out of this situation some crumbs of victory. Hence that parade. That parade is a parade of a country that's threatened with a loss of face, a lot of prestige. Whereas on the 29th of September, the Munich conference assembles without Poland and without Czechoslovakia, by the way. So it is Britain, France, Italy that decide the future of Czechoslovakia. Poland actually then addresses an ultimatum to Czechoslovakia for the restoration of territories that had been denied them. And the Czechoslovakia tried to postpone that, bowing to that ultimatum, and even before they responded to the ultimatum, Polish troops marched into the Czech territory. It is a Pyrrhic victory. It is a very little, in terms of what do the Poles gain from it? Well, a nice parade, but not politically. In fact, the British and French were very angry with the Poles. Not that it made a difference, because the Poles and British, the French and the British were actually fairly negligent in their relations with the Poles by 1939. So when they come back to negotiating with Poland, that is further down the line. But there was a certain coldness, in particular the British withdrawing from diplomatic talks. I would say that we shouldn't exaggerate the implications of this. It's symptomatic of Polish failure to establish itself in that region. But it is not Poland that was deciding what was happening there. It was Germany. In 1938, it's Germany that is in the driving seat. Germany determines. Poland comes in spite of the bombast. Poland comes in very much as a scavenger trying to gain something, and as we know, once the war, after September 1939, again these territories were reassigned. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating paper, which is actually a lot of young students know a lot about zoology, which I find sometimes surprising. But when we have conferences, for instance, for A-level students, there's always a question of zoology in 1939. So this is one of the things that at least the younger generation, it's not exactly that they know a lot about this, but they are curious. So this is a very well-known.
Do they support what happened?
They go through sort of suffering narrative the Poles had to do it. But that's a longer story.
Well, I just came on that. I was 10 years ago in the Czech Cultural Association here, and after a presentation in which I discussed all these three little areas, on the tube as I was coming back, several of them came up and said, "We never heard about it." So not only was the issue of Poland's participation in the destruction of Czechoslovakia not discussed during the communist period, which is understandable, but in the post-communist period also it's not discussed. So you've got the baddies, which is the Germans, the horrible ones, which are the British, and the weak ones, which are the French, but that's where the picture finishes.
Thank you very much, and I would like to ask Dr. Lorman for his paper.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present this paper in such distinguished company. It is a remarkable, yet little noted fact, that the first call in recorded history for the creation of a fully independent and exclusively Slovak state was actually issued in Zakopane in November 1919 through the pages of the newspaper Slovak, edited by Father Stefan Nohel. That was followed up by the declaration of a Slovak National Council in Krakow, which announced that it, at the beginning of January 1920, was the only legitimate representative of this independent Slovak state. Scholars have, with some justification, dismissed this declaration as a Hungarian propaganda exercise, intended to lure the Slovaks away from the Czechoslovak Republic so that they could be reintegrated into a greater Hungary. I do not intend, however, today to examine the larger motives and machinations of these Slovak nationalist criticisms of the Czechoslovak state. Rather, I'm interested in why Nohel and other Slovaks chose Poland as the place to call for a new independent Slovak state. And in doing so, I hope to illustrate the ways in which the Slovaks were inspired, and in fact all the peoples of Central Europe were inspired or influenced by the Polish struggle to create their own independent state during and immediately after the First World War. Slovak Catholics in particular had repeatedly drawn inspiration from developments in Poland going back to at least the beginning of the 20th century. In the years before the First World War, a group of young Slovak priests, including Nohel and, for example, František Jelička and Andrej Hlinka, had criticized the Lutheran-dominated leadership of the Slovak national movement, both on predictably sectarian grounds and because of the passivity of the Slovak nationalist leadership, who boycotted elections and made no effort to build a nationwide organization, but also because Slovak Catholics criticized the pan-Slav ideology of the Slovak nationalist movement, and in particular, the belief that the Russian Tsar would come riding to the Slovaks' rescue, which, they pointed out, ignored the way that Russia treated her her Catholic, and particularly her Polish Catholic Slavic subjects. Slovak Catholics therefore proceeded to create a new party in 1905 called the Slovak People's Party that was critical of both the Majorization policies of the government in Budapest and the Russification policies of the government in St. Petersburg. Slovaks, both Catholic and Protestant, also drew inspiration from the Polish idea of organic work that sought to create a range of organizations that could defend their language and culture, as well as their economic interests and ultimately their national identity. Slovak Catholics were in particular inspired by Polish resistance to the Kulturkampf, and that ability of the Poles to resist the Germanization policies of Bismarck by relying on a vast network of Catholic associations that were established in the Polish inhabited regions of Germany, ranging from parish sodalities to Catholic societies, was specifically lauded by Slovak Catholic intellectuals in the years before the First World War, for they argued that similar tactics could be used to resist the anti-clerical liberal policies of the government in Budapest. And in fact, they proceeded in Slovakia, or among the Slovak populated areas of northern Hungary, to create exactly the same network of organizations, a Catholic civic society, which spread out through cooperatives, sodalities, clubs, even Catholic trade unions, and newspapers to defend both Catholic and Slovak interests exactly on the Polish model. It was, however, the First World War that ensured the Poles would become a role model for Slovaks looking for an alternative to their own moribund leadership and the oppressive policies of the Hungarian government. The news that the Russian Tsar was prepared to restore in some shape or form a Polish state, and that it was claimed, would grant the Poles a new constitution, slowly filtered down through the Hungarian and the Slovak language newspapers, and had raised a whole series of questions and, of course, interest among the Slovaks in northern Hungary. In particular, two questions were asked. Would the Germans and the Habsburg empires also consider major reforms in order to ensure the stability and support of their multi-ethnic populations? And would the redrawing of borders after the end of the First World War ultimately produce some benefit for the Slovaks themselves? The Hungarian government was directly confronted with a conundrum, for it had always adopted a pro-Polish position, but at the same time was unwilling to countenance any alteration of Hungary's borders. Private negotiations were, however, launched with the Slovak nationalist leadership by the Hungarian government under István Tisza, and some minor concessions were in fact granted, such as the right of all schoolchildren to receive religious instruction in their own language. But the negotiations rapidly broke down without the Hungarian government being willing to offer anything to the Slovaks which would match what the other powers were offering to the Poles. the Prime Minister, István Tisza, attempted to square the circle when he was grilled in Parliament about his government support for the redrawing of the map of post-war Europe and what this might mean for the future of the Habsburg Empire. In response, Tisza insisted that there could be no return to the pre-war status quo ante that had existed in Central Europe up to 1914. But he also insisted that no concrete plans for reform of any part of the Habsburg Empire had actually been drafted. The Poles, Tisza clearly implied, would get something. Everyone else would have to wait and see. Indeed, following the Romanian invasion of Transylvania, which was welcomed by some members of the Romanian minority in Hungary, the government's intransigence towards its minorities grew even starker, and its notorious majorization policies were actually ramped up. Slovak disillusionment with the Hungarian government mirrored, therefore, Polish disillusionment with their own imperial overlords, driven perhaps partly by the despair of long grinding warfare, but also by a growing conviction that any promise of future reform could not be trusted. For a growing number of Slovak and Polish political activists, by 1918, the only solution appeared to be to liberate themselves through their own efforts. But that still left open the question of what liberation would actually look like. Some Slovak nationalists, such as Ferdinand Juriga, the sole Slovak MP in the Hungarian parliament, imagined as late as 1917 that a federal state of all the Slavs, as he called it, could be formed out of the old empires at the end of the war, which presumably, he imagined, would include all the Slavic peoples of Central Europe, including the Slovaks and the Poles. His fellow priest, Josef Kaczka, was even more explicit and received a 15-year prison sentence for making this point, that he dreamed of a post-war Slovak, Czech, Polish monarchy, though the court case failed to elaborate or illuminate precisely what he meant by that ambition. There are, however, a number of reasons why the Slovaks ultimately chose a much smaller federation with only the Czechs rather than the Poles in 1918. A key group of influential Slovaks, known as the Hlasists, led by Vavro Šroba and Pavel Blaho, had forged close links with Czech politicians before 1918, in part because they'd studied at the University of Prague, in part because they regarded the Czechs as more progressive than the conservative Catholic Polish leadership, or at least that was the impression. These Hlasists then took the leading role in calling for the union between the Czechs and the Slovaks in the late autumn of 1918. Their arguments were reinforced by the practical fact that all leading Czech politicians favoured a union with the Slovaks and were willing to send Czech soldiers into Slovakia to ensure Czechoslovakia's creation. Moreover, the idea that the Slovaks and Czechs constituted one people had been gradually attracting support throughout the 19th century. Indeed, the dialect of Slovak that was codified in the 19th century as the official Slovak language was precisely the one that was picked because it was closest to Czech. Geography, of course, also played a role. Whereas the Slovak-Polish border was largely impassable mountains, the Czech-Slovak border was open and traversed by reasonably good road and rail links. Direct links with the Poles were also more awkward. There was a tradition of sympathy for the Poles and for the Slovaks among Polish nationalists. For example, Polish exiles in the mid-19th century, such as Adam Czartoryski, had, for example, supported the Slovak right to some form of self-administration. And a growing number of Poles took an interest in the Slovaks from the 1870s. The Sviat Sloviansky newspaper, published in Krakow, urged, for example, Polish-Slovak cooperation and argued that the mixed Slavic dialects found in northern Hungary underscored the tradition and value of cooperation between these two Slavic peoples. For these Poles, then, the Slovaks struggled to liberate themselves from foreign rule, or rule from Budapest, was part of a Europe-wide project that applied to all of the oppressed Slavs in Central Europe, and was captured by the old Polish nationalist slogan, "For your freedom and ours." Such attention, however, also provoked tensions, such as the Polish focus on the Spiš region, which had belonged to the Polish crown from the 15th century up to the partitions, and where a large number of Polish speakers lived in Slovakia, notably the Gorals. Some Hungarians who were hoping to undermine the Slovak nationalist movement urged their government, the Budapest government, to support the Polonization of the far north of Hungary. As the process of the codification of the Slovak language was an ongoing process at this point, there was an opportunity for the speakers of the various Slavic dialects in northern Hungary to be claimed as either Poles or Slovaks. The hope among these meddling Hungarians was that, as Polish-Hungarian relations had traditionally been excellent, encouraging Slavic speakers in this region to define themselves as Poles would bolster their loyalty to the Kingdom of Hungary. The opportunity for citizens of northern Hungary to define themselves as Polish speakers was therefore given for the first time in the 1910 census, and over 15,000 persons described themselves as of a Polish mother tongue. But estimates of how many Poles lived in northern Hungary could actually be presented as high as 150,000 persons who were simply awaiting the necessary education and inspiration to realize that they were actually Poles rather than Slovaks. In fact, some Polish writers began to call for a support for their, quotes, neglected Polish brothers behind the Carpathians. And both Polish and Hungarian organizations were founded in the years just before 1914 with the specific aim of promoting Polish culture in the Tatra mountain region. For example, the Hungarians founded the League of Friends of the Polish People of the Tatras, which was designed to promote this policy of Polonization. In response, leading Slovak nationalists, such as Jurga, publicly worried that the Poles posed a threat to Slovak identity, with Jurga famously declaring on one occasion that the Slovaks never wanted to break away from Hungary because otherwise they would be swallowed up by their Polish neighbours to the north. Ultimately, attempts to sow discord between the Poles and the Slovaks over the ethnicity of the inhabitants of northern Hungary failed because of the Budapest government's view that any effort to stimulate any national identity other than the Magyar was a potential threat. And during the war, they clamped down on both pro-Slovak and pro-Polish agitation. In the autumn of 1918, however, these tensions reappeared as Slovak nationalists demanded independence from Hungary, and simultaneously, Polish nationalists sought independence from Slovakia. It's also worth noting that for Polish nationalists in 1918, I would suggest that the primary objectives were either to create a Poland that included all members of the Polish ethnic nation, or to rebuild and include into a new Polish state those territories which had formerly belonged to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Thus, incorporating the whole of northern Hungary didn't fit into either ambition. The value of the famous Hungarian-Polish friendship also played a role and continued to be voiced throughout the war by Hungarian and Polish politicians, such as Artur Slavinsky, the head of the Warsaw City Council, who visited Budapest in 1916 and gave an impassioned speech declaring the value, the eternal value, as he put it, of Polish-Hungarian friendship. The creation of a Polish National Council of Oravar and a Polish National Council of the Spiš region in November 1918, and the occupation of a part of these territories by the Polish army, underscored the limited objectives of Polish nationalists to modify the border, and infuriated Slovak nationalists across the political and confessional spectrum, made worse by the limited military clashes that occurred between the Polish and Czechoslovak armies at the end of 1918. The Polish-Czechoslovak border disputes that dragged on until 1920, such as the case of Cieszyn, did, however, ensure that the Poles were willing to support Slovak critics of the Czechoslovak state. To bolster their claims to Cieszyn and to other parts of northern Hungary, Polish propaganda began to denounce the new Czechoslovak government as anti-Catholic and publicly endorsed claims that the Slovaks had been betrayed by the government in Prague. The famous Pittsburgh Agreement, for example, which had theoretically promised the Slovaks some autonomy within the new Czechoslovak state, was seized upon by Polish nationalists with almost as much enthusiasm as it was seized upon by Slovak nationalists as proof of the Czech betrayal. In doing so, Polish criticisms of Czechoslovakia began to enmesh with the criticisms of Slovak nationalists, who were themselves concerned about the progressive policies of the Prague government and its refusal to grant autonomy to Slovakia. Thus, the Polish government provided passports in July 1919 to the most prominent Slovak nationalist critics of the Czechoslovak state, such as Andrej Hlinka, Nohel and Jelička, to enable them to travel to Paris to lobby the peacemakers for Slovak autonomy. And they continued to provide support to those Slovak nationalists who felt compelled to leave Czechoslovakia for fear of prosecution. Ferdinand Mackay, a well-connected priest from the Spiš region, who began his life as an ardent Slovak nationalist and then later became a quite ardent Polish nationalist, also helped to foster a rapprochement between dissident Slovak Catholics and the Polish government. He personally persuaded Hlinka to travel to Paris via Warsaw, and he ensured that Jelička, when he took refuge in Poland, was given a lectureship at the University of Warsaw. Pilsudski himself, as Tadeusz Gromada has persuasively argued, also had a genuine sympathy for the Slovaks, declaring on one occasion, "You Slovaks also have a right to freedom and justice." It was Hlinka himself who, however, explained the primary reason why he and his fellow clergymen looked to Poland for assistance. The Poles, he wrote during his visit to Paris, are, quotes, our closest neighbours. And quotes, in the struggle against our enemies, we must depend on all of those around us. Poland became, therefore, a place where Slovak critics of the Czechoslovak state could feel secure and supported with money and other forms of support without being easily dismissed as Hungarian stooges who were dependent on the mercies and monies of Budapest. Ultimately, the Polish government stepped back from formally endorsing calls for an independent Slovakia, or even a Polish-Slovak federation. Relations with both Czechoslovakia and Hungary would have been irrevocably poisoned by such a move. Nevertheless, the Polish government had done enough in the first years after the First World War to ensure that for the remainder of the interwar period, Slovak nationalists, in their search for an alternative to the centralizing, progressive Czechoslovak Republic, would regard Poland not only as an inspiration, but also as an ally. Thank you.
It's obvious from today's perspective that Poland and Czechoslovakia were natural allies, both ultimately threatened by Germany. The Czechs had a large industry which could have provided the Polish army with the weapons which it didn't have, and yet this never came about, and I think that these two papers give some of the reasons, but there are some more deep-rooted reasons which I'd like you to comment on. Firstly, there is a mutual stereotyping of the Poles and Czechs. The Poles saw the Czechs as jumped-up peasants without any culture and extremely demanding, whereas the Czechs saw the Poles as decadent aristocrats with pretensions far beyond their own ability to realize them. And if the Poles thought of breaking up Czechoslovakia, the Czechs gave shelter to Ukrainian nationalists throughout the interwar. period, believing that Polish rule in the Ukrainian parts of Poland were untenable. So I think we have here a really very long-term problem which gave rise to very negative consequences, and the issues which you raised are symptoms rather than the actual disease. And I wonder if both of you would like to comment on whether there is an actual disease, on what this disease was and how one should regard it.
I completely agree with you and your starting point, which is boring, of course, because it's much more interesting to disagree. The starting point is that indeed, when we use hindsight, we think that there should have been some form of Central East European unity, and the most obvious one. Yes. But it was not. It did not appear so at the time, and I think that's the critical thing. That you know, I didn't know about these stereotypes because they don't. You know, they were not part of my background, nor do they appear in documents. But whenever the French tried to bring them together, it wasn't just the Poles who had no interest, but Beneš, who is always presented as a sort of very positive person, unlike some of the less unsavory people leaders in Eastern Europe. Beneš is seen as progressive and well-educated and liberal, and I was struck by the fact that he himself is as capable of prejudice as the next politician. In other words, he had no interest whatsoever in the French initiative of trying to build some regional unity there. So it's looking at it from the perspective of that particular time, it was impossible. What is striking is the degree to which the Poles and the Czechs during the Second World War, the exile authorities here in London, actually did start talking about a federation. Again, one of those plans that didn't come to fruition, but the plans, the documents that are in the Sikorski Institute, and Andrzej Suchcic no doubt will be able to tell us more about it, show how far these talks went, and they included very serious talks about economic collaboration, and one that could have been very impressive, but again, it didn't happen, and it strikes me that that was an exception.
I would also concur with the implication of the question, but I'd like to add two things, I think, on to what Professor Prażmowska has said. Firstly, any potential alliance with one other country would have entailed problems with others. Had the Poles improved relations with Czechoslovakia significantly, they would have alienated Hungary and later Germany. So there was difficult trade-offs. Europe could not have a post-war peace simply on the basis of alliances. And that applies to Poland as well. The second thing is that I'm always struck in my research by the fundamental incompetence of much of the interwar diplomacy that was conducted. Partly that's down to perhaps the lack of experience, but it also extends on to British diplomats who often came to their postings with particular prejudices and failed to recognize that the key purpose of diplomacy is to improve relations with one's enemies, not just to maintain relations with one's allies. And this is something that unfortunately continues to be a problem with diplomacy to this day.
Don't want to extend the discussion too much.
A small question for Professor Prażmowska. Please engage in counterfactual. What if the Poles had not seized that territory from the Czechs? And what would the consequences of that have been?
You mean seize the territories in 1919?
No, 38, 39.
1938.
When?
1938.
Why they did?
What would have happened if they hadn't?
Oh yes, sorry, you did say it was counterfactual. What would have happened is that the Czechs living in that region would not have been subject to extreme Polonization policies, but internationally, because as soon as Poland captured those territories, there was a policy of reminding those people that they are really Polish. So there was quite a, closing down of the Czech schools and, a policy of heavy-handed Polonization. But in international terms, nothing would have happened, because this is not a region, unlike the first Vienna Award, which deals with regions that touch upon the conflicting powers. I don't think there would have been any consequences.
May I ask all the speakers one dimension which has been not highlighted enough, I think, is Russia, or the Soviet Union. Talking about sort of Czech perspectives, visions of the security and those of Poland, the Czechs had a very different view of Russia. They saw Russia as an ally against the Germans. And the treaty of 1935 between Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union is an example of that. Whereas, of course, for the Poles, the threat from the East was a very serious one, so that there may be prejudices, there may have been all kinds of problems, but there's this vital geopolitical difference over attitudes to Russia and to the Soviet Union. I wonder if you can comment.
What I noticed in the diplomatic exchanges that are taking place and the justification that the Polish government puts for its relations with Czechoslovakia is that they very often refer to the fact that the Czechs are not sufficiently vigilant about the Soviet Union. But in reality, I don't think that played a role, because in the end, Poland did not depend upon Czechoslovakia militarily or diplomatically. It was pursuing its policy outside, with no regard to what the Czechs were about. But I think if we look at Polish-Soviet relations and Romanian-Soviet relations, because Poland and Romania have got an understanding about the degree of concern about the Soviet Union. What is so striking is that the Czechs don't have a conflict with the Soviet Union. That's a simple statement of fact. They don't have a territorial conflict. They don't have a history of bad relations. There is a mountainous border there that actually, this is something that the Poles don't quite refer to at that time. But I think if we're talking about why are the Czechs positively predisposed towards the Soviet Union, is because there would be no negative implications, but there would be all positive implications. And of course, again, the French policies come in play here, because the French continuously playing with the jigsaw, which they hope in some way could become the Eastern Front for them. And that jigsaw, frequently they think, well, the Soviet Union should be incorporated, and then they think they cannot be incorporated because it means that the Poles will not be into the picture, but the Czechs will come into the picture. So the French are discussing it as a very live, a very current problem. The French know that the Soviet Union has to be factored into any discussions. And the Czechs would be willing to do so. But you see, any military action, military collaboration between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia is not really viable. You need to have a territory through which the Russians will come to your aid, so they can reach the German border. And of course, Poland will not agree to that one.
As we consider relations between Poland and its neighbours, I wonder why you haven't invited some Lithuanian to have made
That would be a good, yeah.
May I answer that one? The question of the East is something that we'll be dealing with in the next panel. Now, of course, it would have been nice to have had a sort of a 3-day conference with an enormous number of speakers, but I'm afraid we have to be sort of satisfied with a sort of one-day conference, which is predominantly about Poland. I'm very pleased that we do have the opportunity to consider Polish, Czech, Slovakian, Slovak relations in reasonable detail, just as we'll have the opportunity this afternoon to look at the situation at the foreground
would you characterise French military support for Poland between 1916 and 1920? Because of course you spoke of the political relations with Czechoslovakia, but there was of course huge material support for the Blue Army and a delegation of the young ambitious Captain de Gaulle and such. Would you see it as more commercial perhaps?
Not commercial. You see, my feeling is that in this formative period, the French themselves are not well, as no one did, but they are in more of a quandary as to what are the consequences of what's happening into Eastern Europe than we credit them with, because the revolution as it broke out in Russia robbed them of any possibility of, at that time, of viable Eastern partners, we know, but also their plans were always structured on the assumption that in relations with Germany you have an Eastern ally. Now, what was happening in Russia could not have been analyzed with any degree of confidence, of rationality. And we can see the French really do try to understand. We've got, military delegations out in Russia, also in the Caucasus region. There is a lot of probing there, the Baltic region, trying to understand what is happening. And in those circumstances, excuse me, one of the options is to still keep the Poles going, because the Poles, as you say, de Gaulle's mission. But this is, French policy is multi-stranded. It is not one policy. It is one of continuously trying to find out how French security can be guaranteed. And ultimately, the most important element in that one is Germany and not Poland. So you do have, of course, both in Czechoslovakia and also later in Romania, because during the Bela Kun uprising, we know that in Romania there were French troops, supposedly preparing to go into intervention in the civil war in Russia. So it was said, and this is the side that I only get from reading of French literature, I've never worked on that one, that the French generals in Eastern Europe were given a high degree of independence. And the Poles accused the French units that were in the Czech regions of being unduly favorably predisposed towards the Czech demands. So is this Paris, or is it just the generals deciding what is the appropriate response on the assumption that Czechoslovakia is a more tractable country as opposed to Poland, which is just a problematic country?
And of course, to Professor Lorman, I'd like to ask, on the sort of peculiar politics of ethnography, do you think that there was perhaps a barrier to Polish support of pan-Slavic ambition in this folkloristic idea, perhaps quite disputed, that the Polish nobility is not Slavic but descended from the Slav march?
Thank you. It's possibly a factor. There is a more practical factor, that the appalling nature of Polish-Russian relations for much of the 19th century limited the attractiveness of the Pan-Slav idea, which was always predicated on Moscow taking the leading role. St. Petersburg. And so I think practical reasons led the Poles to be skeptical of this idea of Pan-Slavism, because they unfortunately were experiencing it on a day-to-day basis in its more brutal characteristics. And it also persuaded a number of Slovaks, particularly Slovak Catholics, to look askew at that idea. And so the popularity of Pan-Slavism among Slovak intellectuals was primarily a Lutheran phenomenon and primarily an early 19th century phenomenon that diminished as people became aware of the extent to which Catholicism in particular was being persecuted, and Polish Catholics by the policies of Russification.
No.
was one Colonel Ludwig Svoboda to any degree a significant factor in the temperature of the Soviet and Czechoslovak relations?
I think that might not be a better question.
Okay, I wasn't paying attention, so I thought it was going to you. No, I wouldn't be able to answer you that question.
I would also have problems answering that question. It's an interesting question to think about.
Well, he was high-ranking Soviet army officer in Czechoslovakia, was known for his Roosevelt sympathies. He was later the president of Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
He failed fraternal assistance in 68.
Yes.
It was just in 68 he performed a very significant role in preventing a larger bloodshed, precisely because of his record with very friendly record with the Soviet Union area. So that I wonder whether he personally made it responsible for this difficult to understand for a Pole warm relation temperature of the relationship between Czechoslovakia and
Well, look, you quite clearly know more about this subject than both of us put together, which raises the question, why are you asking us a question? But I don't know about this man, but I think that to ascribe the existence of good relations between states over a long period of time, well, you know, to the influence of one person, I think is essentially, you can see historically the period that I've worked on, which is since the First World War, Czechoslovakia hasn't got a problem with the Soviet Union. On the contrary, the Soviet Union is a potential ally, in particular when combined with strong French. You know, in particular, we see that one in the late 30s. When Beneš is here with his the provisional authority that is formed during the war here, the Czech, it's not quite an exiled government, but it's given a status of, ultimately, also enters into negotiations with the Russians in a way that the Polish government doesn't. There's a different history. And of course, as we know, Beneš flies to Moscow and then transits into liberated Czechoslovak territories with the Red Army. And there is no inconsistency there. It is in line with the policies, and there's no threat. There is no, that is how the Czechs see it. And they were not necessarily wrong in that one. A Polish history is entirely different.
Yeah, can I just add to this that there is a very strongly held assumption that Czechoslovakia was not only a potential ally of the Soviet Union, but had been infected by extreme socialist and communist attitudes. And this was partly because of the democratic system in Czechoslovakia that permitted the Communist Party to play a large role, and for the Social Democratic Party to be the participant in almost every government, admittedly in a coalition government. And this prominence of the Social Democrats and even of the Communist Party throughout the interwar period in Czechoslovakia led to the claim made by certain Slovak nationalists that Czechoslovakia was the Soviet dagger aimed at the heart of Europe. And in this ideological clash between conservative fears of Bolshevism and the strength of progressive parties within Czechoslovakia, it's unsurprising that some Slovaks and some Poles came to the conclusion that Czechoslovakia was indeed a threat to Catholic conservative values, and that certainly played a role in tapping into those prejudices and reinforcing those prejudices that Professor Polonsky raised earlier. Thank you.
I have a question which relates to the occupation or the annexation of Cieszyn. So I suppose it's directed primarily to Prażmowska, but there's also a question about the diplomatic skills which was mentioned. And generally the question is this: can we now regard that annexation as anything
also, we are about 9 or 10 months away from September 1939. So the general question, and this is the one which relates possibly to the diplomatic skills, did they not see it coming? Could they not read the situation at all? And I suppose I'm referring to back then the Polish diplomats specifically. I mean, this possibly seems to us as a process that's was already gaining strength, and it is incredible that they didn't see it coming. So I wonder whether you have some comments on that.
What you ask is something that I think every historian should ask, but at the same time not go too far with it, because hindsight makes us literally say the idiots should have seen it coming, which would be historically the wrong thing to say, not to mention linguistically also may be wrong. Adding to the picture that you have already created, that 39 should have, given rise to some planning of Plan B, collaboration with Germany appears, in particular after the meeting Lipski has in October with Ribbentrop. He finds out that Danzig is going to come back to Germany, and there is the consequences of that one is that there are meetings in Warsaw saying, well, what's going to happen now? Does that mean that the Germans really are going to confront us, and are they going to risk losing our goodwill? Added to that, there is also the way in which the French and British behave in 1939. The French, in fact, just signed an agreement with Germany, the agreement that is lost in history. It's one of those, accepting the status quo. But Italy becomes a big problem to the French, and the French really don't have time for the Eastern partners. The French become more focused on their own interests, which are defined in terms of metropolitan France, relations, what happens in the Mediterranean, and the colonies. We forget Italy is an empire, France is an empire, and that is something that they will not give up. So in those circumstances, at the beginning of 1939, Munich appears to have been a victory, and not one that necessarily anybody is proud of, but it nevertheless has, it means that when the Poles tentatively try to open some talks with the French just to find out what's happening, the French have no time for them. One could say this is because the Poles behaved during the Munich crisis. That is not the real reason. The real reason is that the French really that playing now more into the French security and Italy is our problem, that is a dominant debate there. What do the British do? The British government's interest in Eastern Europe had been pretty, from crisis to crisis. If there's no crisis, then we have no interest in it. And likewise, appeasement in the broadest meaning of the word is actually a focus on British interests and British security. In 1939, likewise it manifests itself like with the French. We've got the problem out of the way. Let's think. So there are some, discussions about rearmament, etc., but not about extending and reaching out to Eastern Europe. So Poland literally should have felt very exposed. And my reading of the Schembeck diaries, for example, the few diaries we have, and we have, the Polish archives are thin here because of the depletion during the war. But the difficulty is also that, what you said, they are military men, and what I don't see is they assessing the military potential. That, to me, was ultimately very striking.
I would like to thank for a fascinating question and none less fascinating answers. Thank you. I would like to thank the panelists and you for the fascinating questions. And before you all go for the lunch it's SSEES building, which is right here, I wanted to say 2 sentences about the exhibition. The reason for that exhibition was simply a missing narrative. When you look at the war, and especially regaining independence, these men who fight, die, they suffer, they are wounded, they are buried, but what's missing is the women. So I thought to tell the story of independence through women and personal objects, because people are connected to grand events or events of history also through personal objects. And I have chosen a woman who lived for almost a century. She was born in 1850 and she died in 1939. She was the daughter of an insurgent of 1863, the failed uprising against Russia, and she died on a cart in September 1939 while her family was taking her, while they were escaping the Germans, and then carried her body for 2 days because they didn't want to bury her by a roadside. So I have chosen a woman. She happened to be my great-grandmother, but that's not the important. The importance is that she participated in all those events, because the first 1863 uprising meant that she lost her house, so that she had to move to a different city with her parents. She married an insurgent who was blind in one eye. I'm sorry. He happened to be my great-grandfather, but it means she was living the consequences of the uprising in every life, in every day. Yeah? 2 of her sons fought and were both wounded in the war. They were in legions. And her grandson, the little boy in the white collar on the picture, who is 1 or 2 years old on the picture was taken in 1902. This is the man who was tortured by Gestapo in 1943 when Pilecki escaped from Auschwitz, because Pilecki was arrested as Tomasz Serafiński, this little boy. So in 1943, Pilecki came to Serafiński to tell him, I was arrested as you, because he found his ID. And you have to know it, because Serafiński was at the time the commander of the home army in the region of Wiśnicz. So Pilecki came to him after he escaped from Auschwitz. And as you know, Pilecki was the volunteer to Auschwitz because he wanted to create a movement sort of resistance movement in Auschwitz. Yeah? He was arrested in 1941. So he came to Pilecki's house and told him, you have to escape now because they will come to you. And they did come, and he was tortured. He did survive. But because one of the torture was he was kept in a little cell with water, so when it froze, he was freezing with the water. And he had a terrible case of arthritic fever after the war, so he walked, but he had some metal stuff in his legs and his arms to keep him straight, and he made noise when he was walking. And I do remember him only from this one moment, this noise that he was coming, this old man, bent, really crooked, making this horrible metal noise. So I wanted to show this exhibition simply through the personal things, how this family is connected with different historical events. And I wanted to show, for instance, diaries of the girls, the daughters of this woman, who are writing poems to the boys in the legions. One of the poems was saying, it's better to die than to still live in slavery. I wanted to do it through postcards. Amelia Zechenter was writing to her son, who is he's the commander of the Howitzer cannon unit. Do remember to keep the socks on because you can catch a flu. I mean, this is also part of the history. So this little exhibition that you will be seeing, it's basically one, through women's eyes, and second, personal objects that were collected in my family for years. And they also tell about history because the children were collecting trade cards. So you will see, for instance, OXO bullion trade cards about Piłsudski. Because with each bullion you would get a little card, yeah? Or cards about Paderewski. So the exhibition goes through women and these personal objects, the bullion cards and Goulier cigarettes, which have cards about Paderewski. And now I would like to invite you to the lunch in the Masaryk room, which is on the 4th floor in our building. I think you all know SSEES building. And then the next panel will be here at 2:30 from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the Second Republic of Poland. Thank you very much.